Good afternoon, everybody. It is good to see you. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Winter Park Library. This is our continuing series focus on the semi-quincentennial. It's really part of an overarching topic series that the library offers, in which they do two different things, but they're focused around history and civics. So for this year, we've put the entire time focused on the events of the semi-quincentennial. I'm Dr. Carl Kriesman. I am the Dean of History. I live on the Winter Park campus now, but I've taught at the college for 24 years, and mostly at the East Campus. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I have been looking forward to this one for a long time since we set it up, because of how seminally important John Adams is and how universally ignored and maligned John Adams is. I hope you don't have to tell too many of you, but in case you've not been to DC in a while, he is the only one of the original founders who does not have any kind of a memorial in DC. They've been talking about it for about 15 years, and of course we've had big things, so we all understand big things have come up, but you can go and you can see different things. And there's nothing for Franklin either, to be fair. And so as we'll do later in this year, Franklin's really marked the grandfather of the fathers, so you could arguably say Franklin should have something in DC, but then arguably Franklin has the entire city of Philadelphia. If you go to Boston and you want to go to see John Adams, you can't see his house, his original house, and then the house that he built. But it's the most disappointing type of thing. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, you know how we spent, I don't know, $20 million, understandably so, for kind of our seminal set piece of the Civil War, although Antietam is the more important battle, and it equally has a very less supported center for the National Park Service. But if you've ever been to Gettysburg, it's beautiful, it's massive, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. And then when you go to look into Boston and the National Park Service, it's literally part of a little strip mall. And you walk in and there's a little shop. They have a couple things you can buy. There's a movie from like 1965 you can watch. And you're like, really? This is it? And so it's very disappointing, even in, well, now Quincy, but Braintree, it's even very disappointing there. So you're like, come on, can we give this guy some love? But I'm going to try to prove the point to you. That's the main thing. Because arguably someone could say, well, there were lots of important founders. That is true. I just recently read a biography late last year about Benjamin Rush, who I'll mention in a minute. He's also someone who's one of our kind of founders. And this is one of the beauties of why did America work? Why did it work, right? Which is not part of our topic today, but when you say why did it work, one of the things I teach my students is that for some reason, and you can come up with different ways of how you would wish to say it, but the United Colonies had an amazing constellation of leaders, except for possibly Washington, and then I would add Adams, but you could kill everybody else that you know. You could just take them out, boom, every one of the signers, and the bench strength, to use a sports metaphor, in each of the colonies. If you ever study the Revolution in each of the colonies, you're going to learn a whole host of names of people who were considered brilliant by their peers, significant leaders, some who were invited to go to Philadelphia, chose not to for various reasons, others who just lost the vote. But we're talking about a group of leaders. And so arguably, yes, we could have many, many, many people celebrated in DC for their contribution to the revolution. But when you start then looking, it's like looking at an amazing mountain range, right? So if you've ever been to mountains, you look at an amazing mountain range, you recognize that there are individual peaks, but then the people who really study that will then note, well, that one, that's K2, right? That's Mount Everest. That's the one that stands out amongst them all. So even though we're looking at a wonderful constellation, or we're looking at a wonderful mountaintop of these amazing leaders that kind of led us to this moment that we're now celebrating 250 years later, you realize there are some who stand out, and as you examine the story, as I just alluded to a minute ago, you recognize if we lose Washington at any point during the Revolution, at least up until 81, or maybe 80, we probably lose the Revolution, or the Revolution itself ends. And I would make the same argument for Adams. So I need to make that point. I'm going to try to prove that to you, mostly by looking at his words, some of the words of others. For the entire year, just so you know, one of the challenges of looking at something and saying we're studying or we're examining the semi-quincentennial is that arguably it's not clear when the celebration should be. Now, we all go July 4th because that's the big date on the document. We're all happy with that. But if you've had any examination of this at all, you know that's not actually a settled date. First of all, that's not the settled date of the Declaration, which we will look at in July. So come back in July. We're literally going to read the document. I'm going to have a microphone. We're going to pass it by each person. I'm going to have you read a sentence that'll be on the board. We're going to read the entire thing together. Some of you have been here before. You know we've looked at the Declaration. Next month, we're going to do a series that was supposed to be something else, but I'm kind of pinch hitting, and so we're just going to do like what were the events leading to the revolution. We'll talk in April a little bit more about the Declaration, but in July we're just going to read it. We'll read the whole thing and then discuss it as we go along. So I hope you come back for that. But even that, it isn't clear. Well, I would say, agreeing with John Adams, July 4th is the wrong date completely for us to be celebrating, relative to the Declaration itself, its signing, its completion, all that kind of stuff, right? But then, as I just was alluding to, you get to early December, and we'll look at this in December of this year. You get to early December of 1776, and the revolution's hanging on by a thread. If there were popular opinion polls, there weren't, but if there were, and you could look at some of the evidence, I would offer maybe no more than 15% of the citizens in the 13 colonies, it's a December 1, were supportive of the revolution. They're all like, hey, it was a good try. I kind of kept my head down. Nobody knows I was a patriot. Let's just all kiss and make up. Let's go back, right? And then, of course, he crosses the Delaware. Boom. All of a sudden, new energy. And so from January of 77 all the way through 81, it's a dicey thing. And then, of course, some would argue, which we're not going to do that this year, but some would argue that really the country's not established till 87, 88. With the Constitution. I don't agree with that, but still some would say that. Some would even say the country is not official until you get to 1815, that we have to win the next war. So in other words, when we're saying, hey, 250, woohoo, you were born on a certain day and you came into existence. The United States does not come into existence on July 4th. The question of when it comes into existence is kind of like, oh, I'm not really sure. So let me just back to John. Because then we have to say, what enabled the revolution to go the direction that it went? And who guided it there? And obviously Washington is critical. In fact, I thought when we set this up, we have these different things we're doing this entire year, many of them to match the actual date. So in January we did Thomas Paine. In December we're doing the crossing of the Delaware, because it matches. December of 2026 to match 76. But we don't have a specific month just on Washington. And so I thought somebody would look at him and say, why isn't there a month on Washington? Well, that's because we have 4 months on Washington, because he's that important. We're looking at some of the key things he does in 76 that kind of carry us through. So that said, then, we'd say, well, who else helped us get there? And so that leads us to John Adams. So what I will try to argue is that he is equally as important. Now, he himself conceded to say Washington is the father of the country, but he did so begrudgingly. But he did say it. He did kind of acknowledge it. But if Washington is number one, who's number two? I can promise you it's not who you think it is. It's this guy. So we're going to try to make that point, try to show you his role in kind of working our way through. So let's start off and learn who he is. So his background is real simple. He's from very, we would say low middle class or working class, we might say, people. His ancestors came over in the 1640s, got established in New England of the Puritan kind of dominant faith. We talked about colonization here before. Proved to be very bright, was not rich enough to necessarily get an opportunity, but through his intelligence was afforded the chance to go to Harvard, does go to Harvard, does well. He's not the most important person there, goes with some significant people like John Hancock, like the Quincy brothers. He knows these guys, he knows, he's friends with them, Jonathan Sewell. They're all kind of in this time period and connected and stuff. He comes out, passes the bar, begins the process of a lawyer. I'm gonna make this point later, but I'll say it now. It's interesting when you look at a person's life, it is the contextual events around them that often kind of sets in motion things that later could not have happened had that specific events not happened. So a great example, another guy I really like is Ulysses S. Grant would have been basically just a failed farmer or a failed banker, maybe somebody who stayed at the level of a colonel in the military had he been allowed to stay in the military, except for the fact that he was the age he was in the place that he was when the Civil War happened. So that opens a door for him that kind of led him on a path to where he eventually becomes one of our presidents. So Adams has this thing kind of going on as he's working his way through. Marrying Abigail is perhaps the most important thing. Where's my little better shiny light thing? There we go. Marrying Abigail and the Smith family. Abigail's one of three sisters. Fascinating woman. Her father was a minister and trained his kids to be thinkers. And so John actually was in love with somebody else, and then she picked somebody else herself, although she went to her grave still appreciating John, thinking it might have been a good match. So Abigail was his number 2 choice, but it turned out to be fortuitously the right choice because she was his intellectual equal, some might argue his better, and she will, through all her life till she passes, be his, in some sense, his only confidant. Not confidant so much as his only advisor. He was always looking to her to say, what do you think? And that was unusual. Maybe it's unusual today, but it certainly was unusual at that time, how much he valued her mind in the process. And we could do an entire talk on Abigail, and I do hope you come back, not next month, but May, when my peer, Dr. Bryson, does the Women of the Revolution, in which Abigail will be somebody that I believe she's focusing on, or at least spending some time with Abigail. All 3 of the Smith daughters, or sisters, were great. So in 61, so again, he's married in 64, he passes the bar at 59, so he's just a lawyer, right? He's, at this point, 24 years old, just starting out his career. Not thinking about the life he's going to have, except just trying to, find a wife, which he does, and then, live a decent life. But in 61, he argues that the revolutionary journey starts. Now, when we do Road to the Revolution, you come next month, I will say we're kind of going to start in one sense in 63 after the French and Indian War. But John always pointed to this moment in 61 because one of the things you have to keep in mind of what's happening with the revolution is that it is coming out of the war, so in the, say, 1760 forward, that the British government, we should say, is more aware of this part of their country. We'll use that term. They wouldn't use that term. They wouldn't have said empire. But they were more aware, hey, we've got a lot of people living over here. And because we had just fought that war over there, the government turns its mind to, they would have said, better integration with the kind of national group. And so what the colonists have been experiencing for a long time is what we call salutary neglect. And what it meant was salutary, nobody's trying to harm you, neglect, nobody's telling you what to do. And now all of a sudden there's this focus on saying, we are going to start governing you like we do everybody else. We, the British government, right? So it's important for you to keep in mind as we're going, whatever you might have been taught in, like, say, 6th grade, get it out of your head if what you have is the typical statement, which is, we were our own country, minding our own business, and some other country came and tried to take us over. Or some other country came and tried to impose itself on us. That is 100% false. And had you talked to, if you take Doc Brown's DeLorean and you go back to any one of the 13 colonies, and you talk to people, they would have told you happily that they were British citizens. And repeatedly, the rights that will be argued, including right here by Otis, is that they will be pointing back to our constitutional understanding, although they didn't really have a constitution, that was expressed in the 1689 Declaration, and then eventually we call it the Bill of Rights. So everything they're going to argue, and when you come, if you do come back in July, and we're going to read through the Declaration, every argument that's made and every writing that these guys make over the next 20 years, or 15 years or so, will be, hey, we have this right. What right? In the Declaration of Rights, and we have it because we are British citizens. Now, the best way to understand the overarching aspect of the American Revolution is that it's a civil war. Okay, so having said that, so then at this point, what Otis is doing, and he's a hero to John Adams, the Otis family, is he's the first one to kind of argue against a new effort by the government to control what's going on in the colonies. There's a whole longer story that we don't have time for, but just understand, Otis, he represents a series of merchants, and he goes to court to try to argue against we would say, a new law or a new setting of structure. Imagine the government decided they would tell states how much our state sales tax could be. And so we have a sales tax, and whether they want to take it away, just imagine the national government tries to tell us. We might go, whoa, that's not your call. You don't get to do that. So the sense of now the national government saying, hey, there's a few things we want to deal with that previously have not been dealt with. Otis loses the case, but it really, in Boston, really raises the flag of what's the government trying to do here? This is the time, a couple years later, when Adams has his first writings, in which he's coming out on the side of saying any new effort to try to impose is something that we find distasteful. So he writes as he's this guy plow jogger, and he's basically writing using rustic dialect, kind of like making fun of the government's decisions. There's plenty of seats down here, anybody who needs to come in and grab a seat. Then this leads us to the Stamp Act. And again, from the details, come back next month. We're going to go much more into detail on what happens here. The short version is the government is trying to solve the reality that the citizens in the New World are not paying their taxes. It'd be as if you and I find out that people living in Texas or Illinois are not having to pay the income tax because a former president was from there. We might go hold up, I might have liked that president too, but y'all have to pay your taxes. Everybody's got to pay your fair share. So that's all the Stamp Act is. But it's far-reaching, and it's not indicative, or it's not controlling a trade good, which all the previous efforts to tax had controlled a trade good. This was sort of like just a broad-scale kind of tax. And so up and down the seaboard, people complain. This is one of the coming out moments for a young Patrick Henry, who's kind of arguing. He and John are the same age, or 29. John's going to turn 30 in this year. And you can see that there's going to be a rise of violence in the process. So one of the outcomes of this was that up and down the seaboard, it was decided we should have a gathering of political leaders. It'll be known as the Stamp Act Congress. And only 9 of the colonies will send people, but it's really one of the first moments of, you can see politically, people thinking, how do we address this? And they're thinking, can we coordinate something collectively? It'll be very difficult for them. They've never really worked together for any specific reason. So in Massachusetts, they were going to have a special gathering of the legislature. And the legislature was charged to pick representatives to send to the Stamp Act Congress. In the city of Braintree, which is where Adams lived, he was asked to write out instructions to the representatives. So in other words, from our city, what do we wish the representatives going from Massachusetts to the Stamp Act to the Congress, what will they say or do? Everybody with me? Okay. Maybe you can always interrupt him, by the way, if you want to. It's all good. And so Adams writes instructions to Braintree's representative concerning the Stamp Act. It was so popular, it got into the news, and it was so popular that over 40 cities in Massachusetts said, hey, this works for us, and so they just adopted it. It's really the first moment when the name John Adams is in front of a larger audience. And people are saying, oh, wow, who is this guy? What's he saying? And he's arguing that, again, the English Bill of Rights gives us leverage or the ability to argue against the Stamp Act. Now, what he was saying is, in the Bill of Rights, if you read it, 1689 Bill of Rights, there is a statement that can be understood as the only people who can tax somebody are the people themselves. In other words, consent must come from the people, either directly or indirectly through representatives. So this is where you're going to get leaning into that idea of no taxation without representation. Now, there's a whole bigger backstory. I'll just give you some foreshadowing. The sentence I just told you is not true. But that's the argument we're going to make. Hey, we have no representation. And so John is leaning in on this, and he's saying, hey, look, There's no direct representation by us, meaning Massachusetts. Ergo, they can't impose a tax. But what I really want you to focus on is the next point. Because Adams is really the first one to note something that had happened in some of the laws. And some of the new laws coming from the crown or from the parliament were aimed at attacking smuggling. Now, the issue of smuggling is itself a great illustration of how what we really have in the American Revolution is an argument about definitions. And they're talking past each other. And unfortunately for the British, we might say fortunately for us, but regardless, nobody really takes the time to say, hang on, let's back up. Let's just get similar definitions on the table here and see if we can understand what is the complaint. They don't ever do that. But so in this attack on smuggling, one of the things the Crown had done is they changed the breaking of that law from a misdemeanor to a felony. And then they had decided, because they couldn't trust, they thought, Massachusetts' own citizens to have a fair jury trial, they removed it from a jury trial to a trial at the Vice Admiralty Court, meaning a sitting judge would decide for himself what the deal was for this person who's a smuggler. And so Adams is the first one nationally to point out, we have a problem here. The problem's not the representation piece. The problem is that they're undercutting, once again, what's in the Bill of Rights, that we should be allowed to have jury trials. While many of us, or people that you know, may detest getting a jury summons, the fact that we have a jury summons is one of the most unique, wonderful things in world history, that the fact that we now disregard them or even decry them is evidence of how far we have lost the understanding of what a good citizen is. Next time you get a jury summons, you should celebrate. Call your friends, I got a jury summons, it's amazing! Because you know you want to be a good citizen, and you're happy to go. In fact, you'll cancel other things rather than canceling the jury summons for something you might have had scheduled. Because you can't believe that you live in a society in which you, an average nobody like me, gets to sit on trial for your neighbor. Unheard of in world history. So he's pointing this out. Now again, the fact that this comes in his 20s, as I said earlier, is really kind of instructive because it really illustrates the fact that it's going to raise questions relative to who he is, and it's going to really sort of shape his thinking. And it is at this moment that Adams really begins investigating through his studies of what would be good governance. Now, if you know anything about our U.S. Constitution, you know James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. Fair enough, I will say it also. But the most brilliant constitutional mind is not James Madison, it's John Adams. And Adams, while Madison was still a boy in school, was thinking and saying, well, what could we do? And if you really want to try to grab the significance of the semi-quincentennial, it is the fact that in 1776, nobody thought like this. When we write, that the ideas of rights and liberties are somehow obvious to everybody, self-evident. No, they weren't. Nobody believed that. Nobody understood that. This is why when if you study world history and you look at empires and kingdoms and revolutions where there's no, not revolutions, and kingdoms and monarchies where there's no government of the people, you never see any revolutions. Or if you see them few, they get put down brutally. People understood a system of governance that allowed it to be the normal way of doing things. So Adams is thinking, but wait a minute, what if we tried something else? So he begins examining this, and he does it through this writing called A Dissertation on Canon and Feudal Law. So basically he backs up. So canon law, it's the laws that were governed by the papacy. We might say the church, but feudal law, the laws governed by the nobility. So through the Middle Ages, law as we understood it was one of these two things. And most places that you would live, if you broke a law, first thing that was decided is, did you break a canon law or did you break a feudal law? And then that's where you'd go to court. You'd either go to a church court or you'd go to the court of the nobility. And of course there's no jury trials, and so you'd be ruled upon. And so Adams begins investigating this, saying, well, what does this mean? One of his key takeaways, which we'll see how he emphasizes this in the Massachusetts Constitution, is he recognized that the problem is that the people are not educated. If you limit education, you then undercut the ability of the people to actually self-govern, which for us in 2026 should raise anew for you a sense of saying, Am I asking my elected leaders to put a proper emphasis and, we would say, funding into education? And then you'd ask the educational leaders, is that funding being used well? I think you could argue in both cases we're not doing enough or doing what's right. Now again, to make the point for you, I'll show you this quickly. I've shown you this before if you've been here. The normal stance in the governing system throughout world history is what I call the power pyramid system. Different titles, different groups, different ways of thinking about it, but this summarizes it. In general, most places are led by a single person, and he, and sometimes she, may have a small group of rich, aristocratic advisors, but then the bulk, the 80-90% of us, are on the bottom. Nobody asks your opinion, nobody wants your opinion, nobody thinks you would even have an opinion, and if you did have an opinion, it's probably a stupid opinion, so we don't want to hear it anyway. The idea that people could be involved was foolish to everybody. If you know your world history, you're like, wait, there's a couple of moments. Yes, there's a couple of brief moments, and they're very short, and they die quickly. One of the things as we celebrate 250, we should be saying to ourselves is, wow, in world history, not only is a government of the people rarely done, the few times that it's done, it is hard to keep. And one reason why it's hard to keep is, go back to what I just said about jury trials. We eventually grow to where we don't value the rights that we have, and we kind of just mail it in. Let somebody out through the jury trial. I want to go to the beach. That's our attitude. That's a lot of our attitude. It's not just you guys, it's probably me as well. So what he's noting is he's saying, look, we have to have good education. We have to accept what Locke and Hobbes both say, which is that rights do not come from government, but rights come from the fact that you're breathing, which means they come from God. And that there's always this threat, and this becomes one of the things that John will keep for his entire life, this threat from what he called here the great people. He'll often use the term aristocracy or the aristocrats. But in that process, what he's saying is that, back here for a second, this middle group, they have access through wealth to the leadership. And because they have access through wealth to the leadership, it is most likely that they will do everything in their power to keep everybody else out of access to the leadership. So he's always concerned with this. One of the things that he does, he gets everybody frustrated with him later. It's one of the places where there's a big difference between him and basically all the other people, is that he recognizes the term aristocracy or the aristocrat is not merely limited to the European terms related to Middle Ages and feudalism and the nobility. That within every system, an elite emerges. Sometimes the elite is by knowledge, so it's a very smart person that the cities and the citizens recognize, oh, she's brilliant, so they elevate her, but often it's just money. And so we were not ever going to, he would argue, get rid of that group. This is where he and Jefferson really part ways. Because Jefferson, who of course was an aristocrat, living on a mountain with slaves, would claim, I'm a common man, and we're all common men. And John would just stare at him with his mouth open. Like, how can you say that with a straight face? But he could, because Jefferson's a good liar. And so you can see here, in feudal and canon law, Adam said the people were held in ignorance. Liberty with her knowledge and virtue too seemed to have deserted the earth. He looked back at the one attempt the British made to do a government of the people, known as the Commonwealth, and he noted its failures and its issues, but he walked away with it, still saying, ultimately, a republic. Now don't get lost in our political parties, that's got nothing to do with this. A republic is the best possible government to promote the interest, dignity, and happiness of man. Okay, good. Look at the warning in the next sentence. This is what we should be paying attention to in the year 2026. That, even in that type of government, it's easily destroyed through commerce, luxury, and avarice. Now, he wrote this later in the 1800s, but still. So, in his writings on canon and feudal law, he turns his focus to the Stamp Act, because it's obviously happening at this moment. And so he again reminds everybody about the British Bill of Rights. And then he, in his writing, now nobody in Parliament's reading what he's written, but he's writing as if he now is writing to the Parliament. And so he's pointing out to them that, look, if you guys abuse power, you're going to get an uprising. So he's really kind of forecasting where we're going to go. And then you can see how he's pointing to the Parliament as abusing its power, and he would say to enslave all America. Now, because we get to stand here in 2026 and can look back and have the whole scope, we know John's wrong here. There is literally no thought by anybody in Parliament that they somehow want to control, enslave, take over, or ruin the United States. They're just looking, as we would at Texas or Illinois, and say, hey, pony up, pay your fair share. Aren't you part of the nation? You're saying you're one of the citizens. Then join in with all the equal rights and responsibilities that we want everybody to. But because the colonists had this time of salutary neglect over arguably 150 years, we're now in the fourth and in some cases fifth generation of people. They don't hear that. And so again, here's this example of we're just going to talk past each other. And unfortunately, certainly unfortunately for the British, there's probably no way for you and I could go back in time and kind of play some game of trying to get involved. There's no way to make them understand what's going on. One of the things that John has really missed here is he's misunderstood. In fact, all the colonists did. They misunderstood what the government of England had become post-Glorious Revolution, and particularly post-Hanoverians, when they take the monarchy and they go to Germany to find a good Protestant who can fit in. And that's when you get your very first prime minister, Robert Walpole, who basically is meant to be the translator for the King George I, who couldn't speak a lick of English, so he need to tell him what's going on. But they called it monarch in parliament, or king in parliament, meaning the king was consistently bound by what parliament would do, and parliament and the king have this interweaving of activity together. So you're going to see a lot of letters, if you keep reading and studying about the road to through our revolution, of us appealing to the king as if he has independent right and power, which he doesn't. And then in the Declaration, which we'll read, it shifts over with pain, but you begin to have people now arguing that the king is a tyrant doing evil things to us, of which most everything, as we'll see in July, that Jefferson and the boys wrote was false. I mean, lose in a court of law. There's no evidence for the thing that we claimed. Now, Stamp Act's repealed. John goes back basically to writing the law court, and everything's fine. But this is the beginning of where you can see in the different colonies, the royal governors are themselves becoming aware that they're in a precarious position and that there is a rising sense of unhappiness. And so they want to cultivate people to bring them to their side. And so one of these people is John Sewell, who was, as I mentioned, in Harvard with John Adams. They became friends. They were friends. Sewell gets offered a position in the government. Adams gets offered multiple times positions in the government. Adams never takes it. Sewell does. You need to see that not as, in my opinion, not as Sewell being some kind of a I don't know, greedy whatchamacallit. He's just a kid that if you were asked by, our city government or by our county government to do something, you might go, oh wow, I'm honored. That's amazing. I'm glad they thought of me. And then you may do it, and particularly you may do it if you thought you could do it and get paid a decent amount of money with perhaps a little amount of time, and you're like, I'll do this. This is kind of cool. Put on my resume. I did such and such. But it is fair to say that the governors at least knew, and particularly in Boston where you have Thomas Hutchinson as the governor, they really are thinking in terms of I need to cultivate people out of the unhappy crowd and back over to the government side of things, the normal side of life for all of us. So Sewell begins writing essays, and Adams answers him. So this is the beginning of their breaking of their friendship, in which you can start seeing this divide happening between them. And they're really basically arguing their points. And so after the Stamp Act, before you get to 1770 and the Boston quote-unquote massacre, you have this setting in which you can sort of see the lines are getting drawn. It's an interesting question with the semi-quincentennial, like, okay, when does the revolution really start? And again, I showed you, John Adams would say 1761. But I don't agree with him. I don't think that's accurate. And I don't know that there is a great answer. One of the things that our revolution is part of a larger Anglo-American pattern of about 550 years in which every 80-ish years there's a crisis, right? And ultimately the way to understand that crisis is that you end up with what I call a philosophical divide in which the two sides can no longer hear each other. So even though you may be somebody who doesn't want to see conflict, you're like, why can't we just get together and talk? generally we can't because we're at the point where we're so angry with each other. And hopefully you've never experienced this in your private life, but both in business, in social institutions, and nonprofits, and in personal life, as well as larger groups. I'm sure you've at least seen it, where people who were previously friends, somehow now, 5 years later, 7 years later, sometimes less, they hate each other and they just can't talk. And third parties can say, there's a way to get past this, but now too much harm has been done. That's where we're getting here with these letters as an example of how that tension is rising. So then we get to the Boston Massacre, which begins in 67 with the passing of the Townsend Acts. And there's a longer reason why they did the Townsend Acts, but basically they were trying to actually do what the colonists said they were willing to do. The colonists said, hey, we're willing to pay taxes on direct goods. And so the government said, okay, fine. They taxed everything. The colonists said, oh, that's not what we meant, and it got mad. Troops are brought into the town because you start having crises. You have people being attacked. You have homes being burned down. And because that happens, you have no police force at this time, so you have to figure out a way to try to solve that problem. So troops are there. And so ultimately it leads to an explosion. You have people like John Hancock, who by this point is probably the most popular man in Boston. He's seen as a city leader, seen as a great guy. He's wealthy, but he shares his wealth. He seems like a rock star. He gets arrested. Adams defends him in the Admiralty Court. He loses his ship. It's impounded. It cost him a lot of money. He's held up, Hancock, as sort of a hero in the process. And that all kind of spirals to the explosion where the 5 people are killed outside the customs house. What's significant for us about this is that Adams was approached by representatives of the soldiers and then later the captain to say, will you be our lawyer? And it's very interesting kind of investigation. If we had time, you kind of go back and look at conversations that Adams had with Abigail and try to think their way through, is this the right move or not the right move? As I just told you, people like Sewell had already been kind of coaxed over, and Adams wanted to be certain that he was not kind of falling prey to this. I think it's fair to say at this point, Adams is a moderate, but if we were using conservative liberal, he was a patriot moderate. He believed that we're probably moving towards some change. He's not believing in the independence. Nobody, except maybe his cousin Sam at this point, is believing there should be independence or some kind of a break from our nation, basically leave our nation, fight a civil war. But he is not on the side of saying, hey, we should just kiss and make up, or that this is no problem whatsoever. And so to be asked to defend these guys was problematic. But what John believed was the overall sense of justice was more important. And I already told you that he was so focused and concerned about what was happening in the issue of jurisprudence and his unhappiness with the decline or the moving away, in some cases, away from jury trials. So he said, I'll do it. So he defended them both. So the first one up is for Captain Preston. He gets him fully acquitted, mostly making the argument that where was Preston? He was standing in front of his troops. So if he was standing in front of his troops, he's not going to order them to fire, because that was the charge. He ordered them to fire. Nobody knows where the word fire came from or what led to the first shot. We'll go into more on this next month. But long story short, Adams is like, look, he's in front of the troops. He's in front of the troops. He's not going to order anybody to shoot. All right? Which, by the way, if you go back to this painting, which, again, I myself wish we could do both this month and next month at the same time. If you notice here, here's the captain, and he is painted by Revere as behind the troops. This is a propaganda masterpiece. Most of it's false, but it's a masterpiece by Revere. If you thought fake news was a new concept, not a chance. Not a chance. All right? So, in December, he has to defend the soldiers. A little more tricky, because obviously people were killed, and they did shoot. So it wasn't like they didn't shoot. And so he makes the argument by saying, basically, first of all, they're only here because of the government. The government screwed this up by bringing them here. But then once they're here, they're attacked by a mob. So it's very clear there's a mob. These guys didn't do it. They didn't go out seeking these people out. They're just doing their job, standing on sentry duty. And if they're attacked, do you expect the soldiers should behave like a stoic philosopher, lost in apathy? And then his killer line, of course, is here. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. He gets them acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter, had their thumbs branded with the letter M, And all the soldiers, including the captain, were left. They were stationed out. They moved away from the city. Eventually, all the soldiers in Boston are moved back out to the frontier. And you can see then Adams' view of this and why it matters. Not that he won. He did not win all his law cases. He was not the world's best lawyer by any stretch. Because he was fighting a judgment of death against these soldiers would have been a foul stain upon this country. Now, two things to note here. One, this. So he's talking about a personalized view. This is important because I think you can see here in Adams that he is making this transition from we are citizens of a larger country, England, Great Britain, to seeing himself in alignment with something else. He isn't, though, at this point talking about a United States. The country he's talking about is Massachusetts. This is why, remember, when we do civics, in our minds, states are small, discrete parts of a larger whole. Only the whole matter. The state's insignificant. But historically, the word state is really equivalent to nation. So when they're saying these things, they're thinking, where's my nation? Which is why our first government is a confederation of 13. We would have said 13 nations. They said 13 states, but they did not mean small little pieces that are insignificant. It's like Luxembourg, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands. They could be a united confederation of 4 states. And that's the equivalent of what we were building when we built the Articles. So he's pointing to Massachusetts, but this is important here. Because he's not saying the stain would be upon England. He's saying the stain would be upon us for having rendered this judgment. Now then, 3 years goes by. John once again goes back to focusing on his family. They're having children. He's working. He's a lawyer. Then this kind of process. There's more efforts by Hutchinson to try to win people like Hancock to his side. He's not successful. It seems as if you're looking at the larger scope of the revolution, that maybe the crisis has been averted. But then in an effort to save the East India Tea Company, a new Tea Act was enacted. It was an act to cut the price of tea. It doesn't work, mostly because people like Sam Adams were very well aware of what this meant for us. That if we bought the tea, we would be paying the tax with our free will. And if we're going to pay the tax with our free will, we can't then argue there should be no tax. So that's Sam really riling things up. He's joined by others. One of the Quincy boys is really important in this whole process. And of course, ultimately, you know where this leads to. What's interesting is it happens up and down the seaboard. So even as the ships are coming to the American harbor, colonial groups in almost all of the states or colonies are preparing themselves for what to do. It's really the Tea Act in '73 and the moment that leads specifically for us to the Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act is really that first moment of kind of a universal opposition. Previously, there had been universal condemnation, so you had to stamp Act Congress. But now you've got groups of people in most, not all, most of the colonies who are prepared to take action to oppose this law, where it relates to them when the physical boat comes in. And so it does happen up and down the seaboard. Boston's is the most famous, obviously 300 chests of tea thrown in. Adams was not there. He was away at that time riding circuit. It's not clear whether he would have gone. He was never somebody who really wanted to get, his hands dirty like his cousin Sam would have. But he noted this is the most magnificent movement at all because we've done something. So Adams himself sees this now turns a corner. Now, for most of us, we find the tea thing so silly, and then the response of the government silly because some of you may drink tea, but most of you don't drink tea. But as I tell my students, imagine the government put a $10 tax on everything made by Coke and Pepsi. We drink a lot of that stuff. Gatorade, all the aids, all the waters, all the stuff. They now have a $10 tax on them. So that's how big tea was. To attack the tea was the equivalent of like punching the king in the face. Again, something we don't understand because it's not our metaphor. But all the goods, think back to your Robin Hood story. Don't you remember the thing about Robin Hood where they got in trouble for hunting and killing deers in the forest? And they're like, we're hungry, we want the deer. Nobody else is eating it, let us have it, right? But no, that was the king's forest. Those were royal forests. So if you killed the deer in the royal forest, you were stealing from the king. Again, for hopefully all of us were like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But nonetheless, that's the mindset. So now, Parliament's like, we have to respond. They actually respond, in my opinion, in a very measured and moderate way. They specifically target Boston. And Massachusetts as a colony, but the target is Boston. It's not the 13 colonies. Now, this is an error on their part. They're trying to be moderate. It's an error because, as I just told you, the opposition was national. So they should have understood, oh, wait, oh, wow, this is bigger than we thought. Again, they're misreading the room. They're misreading the information. So they think they can kind of strike at this and do this kind of a thing. But nonetheless, to the colonists, these are seen as an overreaching grab of power. And so you see then the colonists' response, because they then say, we need to get together, and we're going to get together in what today we call the First Continental Congress. So they're going to have a gathering in Philadelphia of leaders. John is selected, as is his cousin Sam, to go to this. And so So they're trying to get their way through. But after the Prohibitory Act, and of course, as you know, this is after Common Sense has been published in January, right? So after that, momentum begins to build. And so at this point, they'll work to a May declaration in which the Congress in Philadelphia says to each of the colonies, declare yourself independent. Well, that means they need to write their governments. Now, they had colonial charters that had government structures within it. But now, all 13, at some level, begin thinking, well, we need to write a document of governance. So, at this moment, Richard Stockton, not Stockton, hang on a second, it's this guy here, William Hooper. I'll come back to that. Well, William Hooper says to John, I would like it if you wrote down some concepts of governance so I could use that in North Carolina. You can send these to North Carolina because we're going to begin the process of writing a government. So he does. He writes thoughts on government. Some other representatives found out about it and said, I want to copy that. And eventually his friend, Richard Henry Lee, just publishes it and starts handing it out. So Thoughts on Government is really the first kind of organized description of what we could possibly do instead by any American. So there are a lot of writings from a lot of people about the complaints, unhappinesses, frustrations. Again, as he said to Abigail about Paine, Paine's writing is great about tearing down and destroying, but he's got nothing about building. So we got to build. Now, Paine and Paine's supporters would disagree with that, just so you know. I agree with that. What does he write? Government is nothing more than the combined force of society for the peace, order, safety, good, and happiness of the people. Now, what does he mean by combined force? Well, what he's saying here with combined force, and it's going to be kind of the core for his thinking, is that you have to have a mechanism by which every aspect of society can contribute to the government. This is where he's going to get in trouble with a lot of people. I'll show you in a second. Government must be planned. This is his Enlightenment bent coming out with a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, that you can think in a kind of rational kind of way and organize, like he would talk about, like a clockmaker. Like a clockmaker could build something, a craftsman person could build something. He was openly, this was the last part of the session today, a little bit, we'll talk about this, he was openly aware of the problems. So as much as he says, hey, look, this is what we should do, he also says, here's where we're going to screw it up. So these are the things to be warned. In fact, I find his writings on warnings far more present for us today. Whereby if we really were thinking something's gone wrong, which I think a lot of us maybe sort of think, you go back and read Adams, I think you just go, oh, yes, that's the answer. And so we can work from there from a perspective. He's kind of like our doctor. And he is adamant that the structure must be what he calls mixed. Right?
So this idea of a mixture of government, what is he talking about? Mixture of government, right? For him, it comes down to understanding that historically, government has fallen into one of three categories. The whole power of society lodged in the hands of the whole society, the rule of the many, called the democracy. Now that's really only happened in Athens. A few other places you might could say were sort of there. The Venetians would maybe sort of claim there, but I would argue only in Athens. But at this point, in late 1700s, there are a lot of people who are saying this is the answer that we need. Or power placed in the hands of a few great, rich, wise men. That government is an aristocracy, the role of the few. So that would be what most people consider the Middle Ages to be, particularly in the high Middle Ages before you get anywhere close to kingdoms or early nations, right? You would have people in those days calling themselves king, but they had not much more power than the earl, 100 miles away, right? So you have the sense of the aristocracy, or absolute power of the community entrusted to a single person. The government is called a monarchy, or the rule of the one. So for Adams, we have to find a way to mix these things. We can't find a way to exclude any part. And efforts to exclude a part, for Adams, will fail. So you have to have all three parts embedded in the system. And for Adams, the Roman version of what we would call a government of the people is the one closest to this. Now, he doesn't say we should just do theirs, because if you know the Roman version of the Republic, they had two people as the executive. And he didn't think that was a smart plan, because they would argue with each other and that could be problematic. And their Senate was Senate for life. So he didn't think we should have Senate for life. He didn't think that kind of a thing. But that's kind of where he's going. The Republic is the best form of government. Why? This is back to his kind of leading to his background. A republic is an empire of laws and not of men, not of humans. Right? And so he writes elsewhere at another time that a government, and I don't have this up here, is one where all people, the first, meaning like Washington, the last, the poorest, right? The rich, the poor, the educated, the uneducated, are all equally subject to the law. There should not be a system in which anybody has any way to circumvent the law. Privilege, power, wealth, and these are things he's going to talk about. I mean, for me, whenever I read that sentence, I'm like, yep, that's a problem for us. So leave it there. Some of you can already think work that may show up and stuff. But that will be a question that we have throughout our government. And there's at least 3 or 4 times in which the president has gotten crossways with the law, and the Supreme Court has been called into this story. And it's always a challenge of trying to figure out, because like you and me can be arrested, but can the DC police just waltz into the White House and arrest the president? I don't know. I don't know if I want that to happen, but can they? If they can't, then is that being above the law in just functional aspect? Does that make sense? For Adams, that'd be terrible. If the DC police can't walk in and arrest the president like they can arrest anybody else, that's a problem. Now, he also loves the presidency and thinks it's a vital thing, so it is possible that he might have mediated later. I mean, we all change our opinions at different times as we go along. He doesn't like a democracy because it depends on humans, not on law. Now, this is problematic for some people, so I repeat this multiple times in my classes and in speeches. A democracy is a government in which all the decisions are made by all the people all the time. If it's not one where all the decisions are at least that all the people have affordability to make the decision. They can choose not to, but if that's not the system, that's not a democracy. So we can say we want something else that's not a republic, but let's not call it a democracy, unless we're going to go down a system where all the people get to vote on all the decisions. And I mean all the decisions. Bill's having some minutiae debate about an amendment to the bill, where then we get our phones dinged, we have to vote on it. And if in your head you go, that'd be miserable. I agree with you, but then you're saying you don't live in a democracy. You live in a democracy, all the decisions are voted on by all the people, all the time. And that's what the Athenians set up. All the citizens. All the citizens, that's the key thing. We talked about that before in this room, right? So, for him, that's depending on the humans. And by the way, Madison agrees with him. In Madison's view, democracies are impossible because it ends up with majority rule all the time. So that's a clue that we're not a democracy, because we say openly we don't want majority rule. We'll have 2/3 rule. We'll have a veto in which single person rules. So we set up a system in which we say we have nods to democracy. So one person, one vote. And in some of our decisions, maybe most of our decisions made by Congress or in our local cities and stuff, they are made by majority rule, but not all decisions are made by majority rule. So you can see already from the beginning how and the reason Madison would say is because when you leave it to the hands of the people, it's too contentious. And it's always a threat to property. Because then the majority can just decide, well, I want what you have, and you get outvoted, so you lose. There's nobody to appeal. There's no court of law in a democracy. There's no judges, because you would have no need for judges. Because we voted on it, everybody wearing blue, you're going to prison. Sorry. That's the way it goes. And so, Madison's like, that's not good. In most of the cities. That's why a lot of people say, I want a democracy, but I don't want that. So they've got some other things in their mind. That's a different conversation. So you can see now what he wants to do then, and this is where he gets really unique, and we didn't do this, is the assembly should be split into 2 parts. And if you say, we have that, not the way he's thinking. He thinks there should be a body, like to some degree the Romans sit in which the rich elite, and he uses the word aristocrats, end up. And then there should be a body for everybody else. It'd almost be like, and we don't do this, but it'd almost be like we're going to have a wealth bar for who runs for House of Representatives, and if you make more than $80,000, you can't run. Or today we'd probably say 150. But if you make personally more than if you're worth more than say 200,000, you cannot run for the House of Representatives. That'd be Adam's kind of way of thinking about it. If you're at the rich elite, you make north of 400, you can run for Senate. But you can't run for the House. Because in his view, you need to have a place for both groups to feel like they've got voice. Because of his fears that rich and powerful people can take over, which one could arguably say has happened in our country.
Was that kind of like a parliamentary English?
It was, because they're House of Lords, House of Commons,
sure.
But not unfortunately, their system, House of Lords does negligibly, they don't do anything. Right? They do vote on things in the current House of Lords, but it's all House Commons. House Commons is where all of it. So they're really a unicameral system, in my opinion. A political scientist probably would disagree with that, but to me, they're a unicameral system because they just rule everything through there, and the Lords kind of just say, yeah, sure.
So they don't need both of them have to agree on legislation, just the House of Commons?
Yeah. And then again, the judiciary. So in essence, you could say John has 4 parts to his, at least at this point in his life, 4 parts to government. A representative group for the aristocracy, the wealthy elite. A representative group for the lower, regular folks like me and you. An executive, and a judiciary. 4 parts. It's interesting trying to read through some of his things and how he gets there. A constitution founded on these principles introduces knowledge among the people and inspires them with a conscious dignity, which causes good humor, sociability, good manners, and good morals to be general. That elevation of sentiment, inspired by such a government, makes the common people brave and enterprising.